Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So today we wanted to talk a little bit about how the gold rush days for the App Store and the Apple ecosystem seem to be probably over. And so kind of, what's different now, how we need to change the way we do things as a result of that, and maybe, how we can look towards the future, what's likely to happen in the future. What do you think?
Sure, yeah, because it's a funny thing to call it an app, like a gold rush, where obviously, like that's hearkening back to the days when, someone would find gold somewhere in a valley, out west or wherever, and everyone would rush in and try and grab all the gold as much as they could before it all went away. And there's some parallels to that in the sense of like the nature of a gold rush is that it's this very sort of temporary thing. But it's interesting to me with the app stores where, and well, first it's amusing that I remember Apple actually even referred to the app stores as gold rushes. I have this flashbulb memory of Scott Forstall in the intro video for the iPad with his the way he sort of can get really intense with big eyes, saying, "And we're expecting a whole new gold rush."
It's also a little bit funny that it's also in San Francisco.
Yeah. That's true. Their sports team is the 49ers, and it's all very relevant. But it's even there. Like Apple embraced it, that this whole big thing. It was part of the marketing of like trying to get people onto the platform and developing for it. Is that there's this feeling of like there's all this opportunity and there's all this capability that is time limited. So you need to get in there and you need to grab as much as you can. And in many ways, that was true. They weren't lying about that, I don't think, but. It's weird now because they've launched 3 app stores subsequently, or I guess 4 if you can count the Mac App Store. But
I'm not sure that you should.
But for the purposes of this discussion, like they've launched 3 that are relevant to iOS, where they launched the tvOS App Store, they launched the Watch App Store, and they launched the iMessage App Store. And I can't think of the only example out of any of those that I can think of where someone had like this big public, the story you see in Wired or you see on The Verge or somewhere where it's like, developer makes $200,000 in 2 weeks with 5 minutes worth of work kind of stories. And other than the app Phonies, which was an iMessage app that lets you trick your friends into thinking that they'd said things they didn't, which eventually got pulled from the App Store.
Shockingly.
Which did reasonably well. Yeah, shockingly. But that did reasonably well. Like that's the only one out of those 3 stores. Which is not to say that there's no money being made on these stores, but it's a very different mentality, I think.
It's also just a very different type of thing that succeeds in these different stores. So in the case of iMessage, I think the promise of iMessage apps that aren't sticker packs, just apps in iMessage, has mostly been shown to not really be a thing after all. Maybe that'll change over time, but when Apple was announcing all this stuff this past summer and then launching it in the fall, whenever Apple launches something new, some kind of new ability for an app or a new type of app store or a whole new device that will have an app store, we've said in past episodes, we've talked about how there's usually a good chance of success if you are there on day one doing the new thing that wasn't possible before. And I think that's still true, but I think what we're seeing is that even Apple doesn't know before they launch these things which ones will be successful and which ones won't. And even Apple is just guessing about that. They made this entire App Store ecosystem for the Watch, and it turns out that the Apple Watch really is not a hot place for launching new apps. You can, and some apps have done okay on the Watch, but it's not really like this gold rush the way it was back for the iPhone and briefly for the iPad. And the TV, I think we can look at the TV and we can say pretty similarly. The Apple TV, we all thought when it launched, that now that we can make apps for the TV easily for the first time, now there will be all new kinds of apps, new types of things that we can't even think of. And I think it turns out that we haven't thought of them yet. And, a year and a half or whatever it's been in, we still haven't thought of them. And it's unfortunate that what succeeds on the Apple TV is basically stuff that makes sense would succeed on Apple TV, which is video apps for different providers, and occasionally a game, but even then, the gaming market for it, I think, has largely not materialized. And we could talk about why, but it doesn't really matter. The facts are basically the Apple TV app market is really not a place where indies have much action to be had. And most people with Apple TVs are not really browsing the App Store regularly and finding new stuff and downloading it and paying for it and everything else. That's not really happening. And same thing I think with the watch, and I think the iMessage store is just the most recent example of this. When the app stores were launching back in 2008, and then later when the iPad launched in 2010, when that was really beginning, when things were really hot back then, this whole market was like totally untapped. It was like the fresh, green ocean, whatever business people call it. And there you go, whatever. Some oceans are green. So the fresh blue field, and it was easier back then to succeed because there was less there was less history there, and people were actually really excited to get these new kinds of devices and then browse around and throw money around and see what can they now do they couldn't do before, or what can this new device that they just got for the first time do. And then what we've seen since then basically is that every additional platform or store or capability that has launched since then, and that has provided us opportunities that didn't exist before since then, every one of those is seemingly smaller than the last one, or has less potential for indies than the last one. And it's not because Apple is some corporate sellout or anything. It's not that at all. It's that just the nature of these stores and devices and abilities, like the low-hanging fruit was picked long ago, and now we're going into these more and more specialized areas, more and more specialized markets, and adding these kind of like niche abilities and niche demands to the various product lines and to the various app stores and SDKs. So I think this was inevitable. I think this kind of cooling down of the gold rush, I think this happens to most gold rushes. That's usually why they're called a gold rush and not like a gold, forever age of stability. And no, that's like when things cool down, the markets mature, this just happens. So I think this was largely inevitable. I think there's not a lot Apple could do to really change it. And instead, it's our job as the developers, as people trying to make a business in this ecosystem, it's our job not to just yell at Apple to change things that they can't really change, but instead to adapt what we do to basically be more compatible with this new market and to be more likely to succeed. And that's partly been what this entire series has been about. This whole podcast that we do for the last year, it's basically been all about this. It's basically been, how do you succeed in today's market? Not in the gold rush of 2008, but how do you succeed today in the realities of today's market? And that often requires changes in the way we do things, changes in our expectations, and just kind of a more realistic and pragmatic view of how we operate and what we should make.
Yeah, because I think in a lot of ways these things come down to the balance of supply and demand. That's like anything, even vaguely related to business, always at the end comes down to supply and demand. And I think especially of how the reason that there was so much value to be taken from the early days of the iPhone and iPad app stores is that there was a strong demand for these things, and the supply was almost non-existent. And in a weird way, it makes me think of how, like, when you if you divide something by a very small number, you end up with this just massive number. But as you divide by a bigger and bigger number, very quickly you start to shrink as a result. Like the result, which I don't know why that comes to mind for me, but it's that kind of that impact that because the number of apps in the App Store was, a few thousand, tens of thousands. All of the demand was concentrated on those, and so the ability for a developer to stand out from that, or even if you didn't even stand out, the ability to just exist and make money was substantial. And whereas now, any of these things are coming into an environment where the demand is arguable whether it's gone down or not. I'm not sure, because I think if, say something like the watch, my guess is Apple has sold more Apple Watches in the first year of its existence than they had sold iPhones in the year after the App Store launched. Like the install base for the Apple Watch is bigger almost certainly than it was for the iPhone back in those days. And yet, there's just, I think the reality is the supply of things is just so much bigger proportionate to what it was that that kind of easy, it's like what I think draws people to a gold rush is the promise of easy money, that you don't have to work that hard to sort of to strike it rich. It's sort of going all the way back to the mining, right? It's like, it's not that you need to invest the hundreds of thousands of dollars into building this huge, big mining operation and going deep into mountains to pull out gold. It's like, no. Like you imagine a gold rush. It's like, there's just gold lying on the ground and people are just like walking around picking it up. And I feel like there's that same difference where it's there is still money to be made, but it's increasingly difficult. And in a weird way, I feel like that's both good and bad. That I like the feeling that in order to succeed now, you have to work in a more concrete way, and it's harder to do, and there's fewer people who are able to do it. And so if you're somebody who has the skills and the patience and the sort of like, I don't even know, like intuition to be able to navigate that, like you can still do it well, and it's harder to do, so there's less competition for it. But on the flip side, like I also do remember quite lovingly the days back in the App Store, in the early App Store, where doing anything would, get you a reasonable amount of income, and you could very easily get attention in the press or in all these types of places. I mean, it was never easy. It wasn't like literally just like reaching down and picking up gold off the ground, but it was so much easier than it was then. And that was like nice. But it was also was just really unsustainable because that attracts so much attention, and in many ways too, probably creates a lot of bad habits and perspectives as a developer. Like if I had structured my business assuming that those days were always going to continue, I was going to be in for a sore surprise when it turns out that's not the case. And I've had periods of the App Store since then where, it's like my income year to year has, dropped by a half or 2/3 or things. And like, that's a pretty substantial, robust change to have to adapt to. And especially, if you had gone the other, like I've always, generally speaking, been the sort of the one-man low overhead type of developer. But I imagine like it's got to be really crazy if you were a developer who had sort of staffed up as a result and had a big team and had kind of been assuming that those salad days would going to continue forever.
Our sponsor this week is Braintree. Go to braintreepayments.com/radar to learn more. Now, why make payment integration more difficult than it has to be? Braintree's powerful full-stack payment platform allows you to accept nearly any type of payment from any device with just one integration. It's flexible to your system's needs and supports most programming languages. So whether you're using Java, Ruby, or Python, you'll always have a range of server-side and client-side SDKs available. The Braintree code supports Android, iOS, and JavaScript clients, and it takes just 10 lines of code to implement. Check it out today. Braintree makes payments and your job a whole lot easier. Learn more at braintreepayments.com/radar. That's braintreepayments.com/radar. Thanks to Braintree for sponsoring our show. So I thought maybe we'd talk about, in the first half we basically covered things are worse. Here's maybe why basically things are worse and harder now. Now I think it's worth talking about strategies and specifics about how we exist in a sustainable, healthy way in this new environment, realistically. And you mentioned right before the break that you've always kind of kept things low overhead and just you for the most part, and I think it's worth going more into this. Like you in particular, I think are basically like I think you are the most pragmatic and prolific developer I know, because you try lots of things, and I think this is a key survival skill in this market, in a tough market where there's lots of competition and lots of changes and it's generally kind of cooling. This to me is the key, is basically to try a lot of different things. And also critically, I think the way you do things is you tend to try things without putting a massive amount of budget and time into it before you know whether it will succeed. It's I don't know if you subscribe to like the minimal viable product thing or not, but I think what you do is close to that in the sense that not that you put out crap, because you don't, but that you put out 1.0s that you didn't spend 3 years making, and like $300,000 worth of resources. Like you're not pouring all that into a 1.0 because you don't know whether it'll succeed yet. And by doing it that way, you're able to launch a whole bunch of different stuff. Over a few years, you launch tons of apps, and then you can see what succeeds and then build on that.
Yeah, because I think the thing that's probably best to point out too is the reason I take the approach I take is because of what my goals are. And for years now, like I got into this business, like I used to be a consultant, and like there's lots of problems with consulting work, but in general, like the nice thing about consulting is it's very straightforward. You do a certain amount of hours of work, you get a certain amount of money for that work, and the uncertainty comes in, can you have a next client? But if you're a consultant of a reasonable quality, like finding work is usually, and it becomes a natural, relatively straightforward process. And that for me what didn't appeal to me about that is that I felt like I still always was sort of, I never felt secure in where I was, because if I didn't find a next client, suddenly my income drops to zero. And so for me, when I got into products, my goal was always, it's like, can I take the approach of being self-employed, which is in both cases was what I was going to do, because I fits better for my mindset to be self-employed. And I was like, can I be self-employed in a way that provides consistent, predictable income into the future, not just predictable income in the present, which is what consulting was. And so I got into products in the hopes of like creating what they like the mythical passive income thing, where you make something and then it creates income into the future rather than doing work in the present that creates money in the present. And because that became my goal, like I didn't go set out with the goal of striking it rich. In the way that, you kind of, I get the impression this is a lot of game development or things, or movies are another example of an industry where this is kind of the expectation, or venture capital even, where it's your goal is to have this massive runaway success, and that's what you're gearing and aiming everything towards. It's sort of like more like you're going for the lottery approach. Whereas with me and with the way I've structured my business and why I've done so many apps over the years and why I keep doing this over and over again, like I'm working on another app that I'll be putting out hopefully by the end of the year. And it's because the reality of having lots and lots of things is that you end up with tremendous diversity, that both you create opportunity for any of the various products to do well, which is the simple version of that. And then also just in aggregate, 5 kind of not so great results from a revenue or business perspective add up to maybe one good result. And if one goes up and another goes down, you end up in the same place. And like that in a weird way is kind of boring. Like I want my business to be as boring as possible. Like in some ways I love when I look at my revenue graphs and they're just completely flat. Like that's not what like classic business wants you to do. They say, oh, it should be like, what is it? It's like up into the side. I want a hockey stick. I want all these things. It's like, no. I want flat. I want boring. I want an approach that doesn't really grow over time. I mean, growth is great, but it's like, I'll take flat, over up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And so like for the approach I take, and this is why I think it works reasonably well in the modern app store, is that things are mature to the point that things are kind of predictable, that things are, if you are able to get a certain volume of downloads every day for the last 6 months, it's very unlikely that tomorrow that number is going to go to zero. Like that's just not the way the app. Like you end up with all of these structural advantages in this sort of this modern system, and I think that is at its first. If I was talking to somebody who's trying to get into this, it's like making sure that you understand. What is your goal? Like, what would an ideal business be looking forward to? Like, what would you like your business to look like? And then are you making choices to structure it around that? And for me, I want dead, even boring, flat, revenue. So diversity is absolutely the only way you're ever going to get that kind of sort of predictability in your results.
And that's especially important because and it leads into a larger theme for me, which is even in the good times, even like back with Instapaper, especially like when the iPad launched, that was a great time for me. That was the most money I've ever made from anything in a year. and everything I've done on the App Store since then has not reached that level. All of Overcast, the whole time, everything after that, like Instapaper during the first couple of years of the iPad was really probably the peak of my app sales career that I will probably ever see. And even then, I knew I had in the back of my head the whole time, this will not last. Everything goes up and down in the tech business, in most businesses, but the tech business seems to just happen faster. Everything goes up and down. And when you have something good, when things are succeeding, it's very important to always keep in mind this will end. And plan for that. That's just an expected part of your process then. So that way, when it does start to decline or take a sharp drop off, then you can be sad about that. You can try to reverse that, but at least you shouldn't be surprised that it happened at all. You should know like everything goes up and down. And so what that means is when you're in the up periods, plan for the down periods. So that goes to very basic things. First of all, obviously, like save money. Like all the money that you get during the up periods, bank as much of that as you can. And that will help you tremendously down the road when you're in a down period and you might need something to, clear the gap or whatever, or to start a new project. Also in the up periods, when things are going well, leverage that success into things that might help you during the down periods. So for instance, you mentioned diversity. That is number one, So in the up period is the time to start spreading your wings, to start building a platform. So when you have a popular app, that's a great time to start a podcast or a blog or a YouTube channel or something else, Spread out when people are looking at you. Build new audiences, build new places, build new products, start looking into new things. And then when the thing that boosted you up in the first place starts going down, you have this other network of other places or products or apps or audiences that can help you into the next thing or that can become the next thing themselves. And that, the best, you can do that anytime and you should do that whenever you can. But the best time to do it is when things are good, because that's when you have a little bit extra money, a little bit of extra time, maybe, but you should be spending it on that because that's important. That is really the best strategy I can possibly give for, beyond just, what we've already said, which is like, try lots of things and see what succeeds and have diverse income streams. Besides all that, best thing I can say is assume every good thing will end. And while it is good, save as much as you possibly can, and then spread your wings into new things then, so that as those things are building, they're building with your success. And then when the success in that first thing starts to dwindle, you have something else to fall back on or to build up.
Yeah, and I think the key thing to what you're pointing out is that diversity, like for me, diversity mostly means having lots and lots of apps. But it doesn't have to mean that for everybody. The same way, like you in general have been like an app monogamous. Like you've generally just sort of had this one app after another that you've doomed. But as you've been developing and over the last 8 years, you've always been diversifying out into different things. Like you had your blog for a while that was very. It's just sort of that was where your energy was going into, and that's where you were sort of expanding out into. And then you went into podcasting, or it's like finding those, whatever that is for you, that makes sense for you. That like if you're a good writer, maybe blogging's great. If you like video or audio, podcasting's great. I know a lot of people who diversify out into education. You start doing training or book writing or whatever. There's no money in book writing.
That's not a great plan.
Yeah, but training, I think, is a reasonable thing. Or finding ways to take small successes and sort of, it's like turning them into other and broader things is a great way in an environment where you're not going to necessarily be able to just have a runaway hit in the App Store itself. To find a way to make a bigger and broader living. And like that's where you can grow in a lot of ways. And and it is kind of this strange and delightful sort of like cyclical pattern too, where the more you're able to do that, the easier it is subsequently to launch successful apps. And it's the building enough of a reputation for yourself that you can, when you launch something new, people are at least take a look at it. There's no guarantee. It doesn't like make you the thing just like an automatic success, but it gives you into the door in a way that it wouldn't otherwise if you just threw things out over the wall into the App Store and then like walked away.
Exactly. And as you try more things, you get better at doing them. Like it's, now it's a lot easier for me to start a new podcast now than it was 4 years ago, because I've done a lot of podcasts since then. I know how to do it now. I know what works and what doesn't to some degree. And so if I launch a new podcast now, it's way less risky than it used to be, just because I've done it a lot. If you launch a new app today, you can be pretty sure, roughly what it will take to get it done, roughly what it will take to get it in the store, and an approximate, estimate of how much you think it might make in the first X months or whatever, if things go well. You've launched so many apps that now you've just gotten good at launching apps, right? So any skills you can build along the way, in that kind of way, it helps to just build up your competence over time. Just again, the more you try, the more you put out there, the better it will be. And then as things kind of, take seed or whatever, and I don't know anything about growing things, but as the plants that you plant take root, some of them will, and then then again, you're just building up this career over time, this slow growth, trying a whole bunch of stuff, and eventually some of it will work. And then as that works, you keep building, you keep spreading out even further. You build up what you have as much as you can. You save when the times are good. This is how you survive in this climate.
Yeah, and I think it's also probably a good place to point out that more likely than not, your goal it's like you want to have a strategy that is going to work for your career in the long term. It's like taking the approach of like, okay, what I want to do is I want to start off by winning the lottery, and then I'm going to live on my lottery winnings for the rest of my life. Like, if that was your approach to life,
it's a good story.
It's interesting, but like, what does that look like 5 years into that plan? Even if your plan worked, like even if somehow your plan magically worked, 5 years in, you have like this pile of money that you're gradually chipping away at. Like that doesn't sound like healthy from a mental health perspective of like, what you're doing. Like people like to have a sense of purpose and direction in their day and that you're accomplishing things. But it's also just, I don't think, not a good sort of approach to take. That it's not. The goal is to have something that is going to work years down the road. And there's certainly things that I wish I had done, 8 years ago, compared to now. But I think increasingly, then maybe this is like a wisdom as you get older kind of perspective, but increasingly I look at these things and it's like, what am I going to be doing in 5 years? And while I don't know the specifics, like I don't know what that's going to be, what platforms I'm going to be on, if I'm going to be still developing, if I'm going to be still an Apple developer, like who knows? That's, that kind of thing is unknowable. But I look at what I'm doing now and I'm saying like, am I doing things that are going to give me options in the future, that are going to open doors and give me skills and abilities that are going to be, valuable in general, not valuable in specific, because technology is going to change, platforms are going to change, economics are going to change. Everything is always going to be changing, but like I'll be the same here and then as I will be in the future. And so am I doing things for myself now that are going to benefit, like future me is going to be thankful that I was making these choices now, rather than sort of just going crazy, like, hey, things are, if you hit it big in the App Store, awesome, good for you. Like, maybe don't go buy a Ferrari, because like your future self is probably unlikely to be super thrilled about those car payments for the years and years to come.
And the first time you need to replace the clutch. And also, I would end with one more thing too. That as you spread around and as you start things and explore new options, it's very important to explore and invest in things that are on their way up, not that are kind of in the past. And it's hard for me to say that because I like a lot of things from the past. But, like today is probably not a great time to start making a Mac app. As much as it kills me to say that, it's probably not a great time for that market-wise. It's a decent time to be working on things like, YouTube and I don't know what else, but other people can figure that out for me. But the point is, like, invest in things that are growing and things that have a likely future bigger than their present, which is what growing means. And try to minimize how much you're assuming that the past will continue to will continue to exist, basically. So anyway, with that said, thank you for listening, everybody, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.